No, we're super judgy. We
You,
like
you
that.
Yeah.
can be overly harsh about it. It's fine.
Okay. So
The industry needs to be taken over and run by communists again. Is that what you're saying?
Organized money.
I wrote a book years ago, and one of the things I talked about, one of the consequences of monopoly, is there's a general flattening of the world. Like everything starts to look the same everywhere. And that kind of weirdness and uniqueness that you see in a culture goes away. And it's something I thought about when it comes to chain restaurants and stuff like that. But, you know, we have a really interesting story about something that is in everyone's home that used to be really interesting and weird. And we might even have childhood memories of our grandparents having weird, fun versions of it. But today is pretty flat and boring. So, yeah, I mean,
Right.
what you,
And what you're talking about are lamps. And, there was a time where there was this explosion of creativity in just the ordinary floor lamp or the bedside lamp. There were lamps that were also incorporated and were themselves desks. There were these lamps that were just poles that went from floor to ceiling and had these amazing looks to them. And all of the rigging and wiring was integrated into the lamp itself, and you didn't see any of that. There was this real creative force that happened, and it happened between the 1940s and the late 1960s, and then it kind of went away. And the reason it went away is really a corporate power story, surprisingly enough.
yeah. So, we have a really good guest, and sorry, I'm
Yeah,
distracted.
that's fine.
Why don't you just take it? Just take it in.
All right,
I have
all
an
right.
idea for what I want to do a closeout.
Okay. And so we have a really good guest to talk about this. His name is Nick Ferrell. He's a preservationist, historian, a dealer of vintage lighting from this era, the 1940s and the 1970s. And he wrote a book about the originator of this style of lighting. The book is called Modeline of California, Pioneer of Modern Lighting. And he tells this story about how Modeline was really this sort of really originator of this incredible amount of creativity in lighting. And when it went away, along with all these other companies in the late 1970s, early 1980s, we've seen almost no innovation in this space ever again. Nick is great. He deals in these lights. He's on Instagram at EstheticVintage, which doesn't have, it's like aesthetic without an A on it. So it's EstheticVintage. You can find him there. And we're going to talk to him right now about modern lighting on Organized Money.
Organized money.
Nick Ferrell, thanks for being with us on Organized Money. Thank you very much.
thanks for having me.
So, I guess by way of background, we can start by asking, how did you get involved and get into mid-century modern lighting in particular? Why was this a passion for you?
Yeah, so it was kind of a total accident. I was going through going through kind of a reset of my house. I was a 20 something who never really cared about furniture or any, it was just whatever was available and cheap was what I had. And I had some friends who worked in furniture restoration for a living, so I was starting to get some exposure to mid-century modern furniture, particularly, and just thought it was so cool, the level of thought that went into the design. It was unlike anything I'd seen before. So I started to get into that for my house and furnish the house with various dressers and sofas from that era. And then after about a year of that process, my whole house was mid-century modern except for the lamps. And so I turned my attention to lighting and noticed that the process for buying these pieces was very different from the furniture. The furniture was mostly well researched. If I wanted to look for a particular designer, a particular manufacturer, I could find it, and most dealers knew what they were talking about most of the time as far as manufacturer and designer attributions went. But the lighting was the Wild West. All of the information online was guesswork, and dealers sort of, lying about who designed it to get a high sale price. And So it was a mess. And initially I thought, well, that's just an odd thing, and just bought the pieces that I loved. And the more that I kind of fell in love with these pieces, the more that bothered me. That there were these designers who'd created these pieces that were inspiring me and many other people whose names were just lost to history. So that just kept me up at night until I made this a larger project. So that's the Reader's
Yeah.
Digest version.
It is crazy that, I mean, I saw your speech, and one of the sort of things that you highlight is how almost everything about modern lighting on the internet, at least until your book, it was wrong. It's just incredible that this entire history was kind of lost. And one example you have is this thing called Groovewood
Yeah.
lighting, and there are like all these Groovewood lamps. Go on the internet and look for Groovewood. It's Gruvwood. You see all these lamps for sale. There's this whole narrative about the company, and there's even this idea that there's a museum for
Oh, yeah.
Groovewood, like
Yeah.
in Louisville or something, and it's all made up.
Yes. Yeah. No, not a word of truth to that. That was hilarious. I bought a what I believed to be a Groovewood lamp at the time, and yeah, same story with all the other lighting manufacturers, that I started to do kind of internet research, not real in the archives research, but
Right.
and thought, man, this is what an impressive company. They won all these design awards, and they've got Hans Wegner designing for them. And I was asking all these dealers to tell me more, and yeah, I heard the story of this guy's visit and tour of the Groovewood factory and museum in Louisville, and I just thought, man, this is incredible. And then the deeper I went, the more of these details kind of started to fall away, and got to where I found that Groovewood lighting never existed. That it was just an internet, a kind of a bad attribution by an auction house that got repeated, and it kind of snowballed into this big story over 30 years. And that was a really good representation of how the whole information landscape looked when I came into this.
So sort of a kind of a giant AI hallucination before AI.
Exactly, and that brings up another point of, it's not likely to get better without a lot of pushback, because AIs are training on this information. So now
Right. So they're picking up the bad information and then
exactly.
distributing it. Yeah.
Well, let me just ask you a question. Like, what is cool about mid-century lighting? I have no taste. I am a monster. My wife has taste. Sorry to be gendered and all that, but explain to me why it's cool. What they did differently, and why why people like it.
Yeah, well, it's like Art Deco or Victorian. It's just a matter of preference. If it speaks to a person, then it speaks to a person. But I think what makes modern lighting uniquely cool is it started in this era when they had essentially mastered, not burning your house to the ground. That was all of the lighting design up to the late 30s and early 40s. Was a lot of the focus was placed in, how do we make this product safe, which is important, obviously. But once they got there, it sort of freed them up to get very artistic and focus on some other things.
Hey,
Wait,
we
so
don't
this
have to
is
worry
what
about
that-
it killing us. Yeah,
Right.
that's actually good.
Wait, that's really interesting. So lighting wasn't safe until the 30s, and then it got safe, and then they're like, oh, we can do all this cool stuff now. Is that what happened?
Yeah, essentially, yes. I mean, once it became easy to manufacture safe lighting, it freed up all this other energy that was spent on, like I said, not burning their house down, to focus on other things. And one of the things that they focused on.
Sorry, I always have admired Groovewood and how they took that energy from and really
Thank
they
you.
were the pivot point in the industry.
And
from what I
thank you,
understand.
Matt, for giving them their due, for giving
Yeah.
Groovewood
Sorry.
finally the recognition they deserve.
Okay.
Yeah, nobody on the internet's given them enough credit. So
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Good to know.
yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, when you trace this, when you actually did do this work and traced it back, did the research, you found this company that really did kick off and lead this innovation that you were just talking about in lighting, starting in around the 40s. And the company is called Modeline of California. And their creator is this guy named Bernie Roberts.
Yeah.
And he comes out of Hollywood, and actually the Hollywood blacklist. So could you tell the story of Bernie Roberts?
Yeah, Bernie was a wild guy. And to give some context for when my real deep research started into Modeline, this was in 2020. And this was, at this point, I loved Modeline. I knew a lot about who the designers were and kind of some general information about the company, but didn't know anything about the personalities behind it, and didn't know anything about, say, hiring practices. And to be honest, I was really afraid to pop the hood on this company that I'd fallen in love with. You know?
Right.
This is
Like the milkshake duck, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
This is a delightful
Why?
duck.
The hiring practices in the 40s were great.
Right,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
That's
And
what I mean. Groovewood would hire. Sorry.
I mean, Hans Zimmer, yeah,
Pioneer and sorry, go on.
You got it right there. But this is, in 2020, this is kind of peak monument removal season, and so
Right.
I just kind of had in my mind that, oh God, I've fallen in love with this company, and it's about to all kind of get tainted for me.
Right.
And so I start researching a little bit more deeply. And I think the first thing that I found that alerted me that this might have been a different kind of company was the presence of Jack Haywood as a lead designer, who was a black man and not just a designer at Modeline, but giving interviews for the company. And not always interviews saying, oh, this is the greatest company of all time. Sometimes they made design decisions that he didn't love, and he would go to the LA Times and say, they shouldn't do this, and still have a job,
Right.
Which I was thinking, well, that's not normal at the time.
Right.
It's not normal now.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
sorry.
So
Free thought and business don't often go together.
right. So I sort of had this idea that there might have been some different or progressive values behind this brand, just based on that. But yeah, getting into the character of Bernie Roberts, he was raised in extreme poverty in New York, child of Jewish immigrants, and his mom passed away when he was 10, and the family broke apart. So he was there were 5 children, and a couple years later, a couple of them are in foster care. Just a really rough situation. And as a teenager, he made his way to Los Angeles and just said, to hell with this, I'm doing something different. And found a way out there and was working as a machinist. But his time in the afternoons and evenings was spent involved in protests. So he spent time protesting harsh labor conditions, supporting the work of African Americans at the time, working for civil rights. And these experiences that he had, both living in poverty in New York and working as a machinist in Los Angeles, kind of instilled in him these very progressive values for the time. So one of those protests, which was Hollywood Black Friday at Warner Brothers Studios in Hollywood, was sort of a bridge too far, and it became violent, and it sort of gave his employer and his union enough rope to hang him with. And he was expelled from his union and fired from his job, and found himself unemployed and quickly heading back to the income level of his childhood. And he wanted to avoid that. So at that point, he went to his mentor, who was a man named Percy Saltoy. And Percy owned Brown Saltman Furniture, which was an early pioneer of the modern style of furniture in Los Angeles. And initially, he was going to Percy just to ask for a job. And it became this larger conversation where Percy explained to him, he said, there's this huge problem that's arisen in the furniture industry, and it's a problem with lighting. Because where furniture trends are becoming increasingly minimalist and European-influenced, modern design, lighting is not catching up. The lamps that were being sold were very gaudy and ostentatious, and they just clashed with this style of minimalism. So he told Bernie that he believes that some company is sure to come along and develop a modern style of lighting, and he encouraged Bernie to start such a company. So within 6 months of that conversation, Bernie founded Modeline of California. So part of what makes original modern lighting unique from from what's currently being produced is, I jokingly say that a lot of the new lamps suffer from quality control. And that is that you have these products, even they sometimes might be made out of real wood, but they're just kind of finished to death and polished to death. And it just looks like this plasticky, poorly made product that, all the life has been, quality controlled out of it. And, an original modern lamp, even from the factory, has unique personality. You see the grain of the wood, and it's different for each lamp. You might even find what today would be thought of as a flaw, a spot where there's a knot in the wood that was filled, or something that would never pass today's quality control. You'd think of that as a problem, but you don't realize when you are seeing it in person or seeing even a photo of it, that your brain sort of picks up there's this humanness in that, that there's this, personality to it. And you can kind of see like the craftsman's work. Whereas now, these probably you buy a lamp on Amazon or something, and it may as well come from Mars. It doesn't look like humans had any involvement in the creation of this product, because in large part they didn't. These are automated processes, and I would say like the character and soul of these. I know that's an awfully abstract way to say it, but they just have a personality to them and a character that nothing currently produced really has.
Okay, so Modeline used dark wood, and it was innovative. How would you describe the style?
Well, they didn't actually use dark wood. They used a dark finish.
Okay, sorry.
Sort of a little bit of a sleight of hand. Yeah, most Modeline lamps are made out of Carina, which came out of the Congo. When it's unfinished, it is as light as maple or spruce. It's a very light colored wood. And then the kind of walnut tone that you see in Modeline lamps is all in the finishing process. But as far as their style, kind of what made them unique was, now we hear the term modern lighting, and some associations come to mind. You think of maybe what Wayfair has to sell, or if you have an exposure to original mid-century lighting, you might think of, like the set of Mad Men or something.
Right.
But at the time, there were no associations. When you said modern lighting, there were all these competing ideas for what modern lighting would actually be. And Modeline was the company that really developed a definition of modern lighting. And that is lamps that are made in the style of what I call biomorphic minimalism. And so that's designs that are rooted in themes from the natural world, rocks, trees, rivers, mountains. These are all things that sort of work their way into Modeline's design, but done in a minimalist fashion to correspond well with modern furniture.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, on top of that, this sort of depictions of the natural world, there is a way in which whether it's because of the wiring or because of the use of the switches, that it really steps beyond where we were in lighting, and becomes very, very innovative. So I mean, talk about how that sort of caught up, like sort of a way to get the minimalism into lighting is to make it sort of effortless to turn these things on and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. So the guy who was really responsible for the emphasis on convenience that's in Modeline lamps, and if anyone listening has seen a Modeline lamp or seen any videos online of how many of them operate, oftentimes the switch for this lamp, you don't reach up into the shade to turn a switch or have an inline switch. Oftentimes the switch is part of the design. So you'll have a sculpted wood detail that's part of the lamp that when looking at the lamp, you wouldn't think it has any function at all, but you pull it or twist it, it has this hidden feature where it turns the lamp on. and part of that idea came from Modeline's principal designer, who was a man named Arthur Jacobs. And Arthur was a Air Corps pilot before he retired and came to work for Modeline. So he had this kind of pilot's mind of every switch needs to make sense, it needs to be convenient. You don't want to be flying a plane and reaching across to hit some switch that's necessary. You want everything kind of located where it makes sense. And he took the same logic to his design work at Modeline. So it created this incredible trend that spread to a bunch of other lighting companies of a switch not just being a function, but being part of the design.
Actually, it's kind of Steve Jobs-esque.
Yeah.
It feels like Apple.
Yeah, definitely parallels there as well. Aside from just that parallel, the Modeline was big into product placement and using kind of influencers in their marketing, which is a very California style.
Right. Talk about that, because that's really interesting. Like, you would see these things pop up in the background in all kinds of TV shows and movies and things like that. And is that in some way connected to, where the factory was located and Robert's own history?
Yeah, it had a lot to do with Robert's history. So, when he got the company going, I think a lot of people with his political disposition would have quickly set those values down. You start making some money, and things are going well for you. Like, oh, okay, well, I identify with this different class now. But Roberts was this incredible character, and he very much didn't put that down. And he sort of used his position to further his involvement in those values. But one of the things is he maintained all these relationships with unionized set decorators in Hollywood from the Hollywood Black Friday days. And so when it came time to advertise Modeline lamps, he called them up and he said, "Hey, I'll give you as many of these as you want. You can use them or don't use them. Totally up to you." And the next thing, within 6 months to a year of that, you see them all over. Leave It to Beaver, Burns and Allen, Alfred Hitchcock Hour. All these shows start having Modeline lamps all over the place. So it was this brilliant, early example of product placement that.
Right.
So it really was a communist conspiracy to spread these lamps.
It very much was. Bernie was a self-identified communist and very vocal about that until 1951. He had this. So he left the Communist Party for the Democratic Party when he had this falling out with a magazine called People's World, which was if you're familiar with it, it was a socialist or communist magazine that wrote about union issues at the time. And they had fallen on hard times in 1949, 1950, and Bernie personally bankrolled the magazine to stay in business. He was a big supporter of that. Well, in 1951, there was a disagreement in contract negotiations that led to a strike at Modeline, and the company, of course, the magazine sided with the workers as they would, and Bernie took it personally. He wasn't above that, and he, as a result, changed his political party from communist to Democrat. So.
Well, so there's a lot to joke about there, but I actually want to get to the question of the market structure and like were there other lighting companies? Did this create a kind of burgeoning ecosystem of companies that were doing something similar? Like, talk about some of the other things that were going on in the industry.
Yeah, so when Modeline developed the style, the biomorphic minimalist style, there weren't any other really great contenders for what modern lighting would be. Kind of everybody had an idea, but none of them were really sticking for more than a year or two. And then when this idea came in to kind of lean on the visions that naturally captivate our species, the natural world, it spread like wildfire. And almost every lighting manufacturer in the country adopted some version of this wood-heavy biomorphic style. Surprisingly, Modeline was unbothered by this. Arthur Jacobs had this kind of mantra that he lived by that he called contribution over competition, which was the idea that it's whether you're contributing to your field in a lasting and meaningful way that is the sign of your success, not whether you're able to outperform or outsell your rivals. And Bernie very much took this to heart and adopted this idea at Modeline to the point that they designed and patented nearly nothing and never sued competition. The Modelighter switches that I was referring to, the wood pole that's built in, there were dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of companies that replicated this exact thing. And Arthur Jacobs and Bernie were thrilled about this. They thought it was a testament to the convenience and practicality of this switch.
Well, so how did they make money? Was it the brand, or what? Or was it were their lamps better? You know, what happened? You know, how do you make money if anybody can copy you?
They were definitely the best in the game, and they weren't cheap. Modeline lamps were a luxury item for sure, but they very much advertised this is lighting for a lifetime. That was one of their slogans. Where people had become accustomed and now are very accustomed to buying a disposable product over and over and over again, they sort of explained that you're already okay with spending this amount of money on a lamp because you're doing it in installments over the course of your life, and you're not passionate about any of these things that you own. The problem is worse now than it was then, but they said, when you buy a Modeline lamp, you're buying this thing for a lifetime. And even if you come strictly from the economic standpoint, you're at worst spending the same amount, if not saving money, when you're buying this thing that you're going to leave to your children. It's this, lifetime purchase.
Right.
They sold a lot of lamps and for, a fair amount of money. So the company was quite profitable for a period there.
So they had this sort of brand of quality and durability. And they were also always sort of trying new things. There was a lot of, you talked about how one of these chief designers, Haywood, was getting into sort of futurism things, more sort of globes and these kinds of things as they went on into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So they were always sort of on the cutting edge, right?
Oh, for sure. And part of the idea of being a modern brand was having to, in a way, like reinvent your style every few years. Because what the 25 and 30-year-old, first-time home buyers loved in 1946 was not the same thing that they loved in 1965 or 1975. They were always coming out with a new look. Over the course of Modeline's lifespan, which was 1946 until 1981, I don't have the exact number of unique models that they had. The minimum number would be 4,000, but there's good reason to think that it was closer to 6,000 or 7,000 different models. So they were an incredibly productive company.
Crazy.
So what happened? So this industry falls apart in the 70s, and why?
Yeah, so
aside from everything bad happens in the 70s, except for some of the fashion and music.
Yeah, exactly. I was just gonna correct you on music, but so the all the success that this industry had achieved in the 1950s and 1960s got the attention of some very large corporations. There's a couple examples that I usually cite because they're the funniest to me. And that is, you mentioned Groovewood, who the actual company that made the lamps that that are now called Groovewood incorrectly was a company called Bruce Industries out of Philadelphia. And so all these large corporations noticed all this money that was being made in this industry, and they wanted a piece of the action. So they started buying up all these lighting manufacturers and starting furniture and lighting divisions. And so Bruce Industries, that company that was responsible for the Groovewood lamps, along with R&J Manufacturing and several others, was acquired by R.C. Cola. who had no history in lighting and furniture design. They just said, "Hey, well, they're making money. Why can't I have some?" And then a long list: Dunbar, Kittinger, Dux, Pennsylvania House, and several others were acquired by General Mills, the cereal company, who went on and started a furniture division as well. And so
This is like the era when you had companies that were saying, let's buy a missile company and a tennis racket company.
Right.
And that's like the conglomerate thing, which is just we'll make everything.
right.
Okay. So RC Cola, which isn't very good, just the drink, is buying furniture, is going into furniture. Okay, this makes a lot of sense. So,
Yeah,
see, this
so
is what happens when the communists lose control. It gets
Exactly. Exactly. So they start buying up all these companies, and it sort of changed the spirits of these brands from being led by creative artists and being led by people who, all of these designers. I have pictures in their homes from the 50s and 60s, and their houses were full of these were items that they themselves were passionate about. And it sort of turned this idea of it being led by creative artists and free thinkers. It turned it upside down, and it became, sort of this line item on this multi-billion-dollar industry. Of like, okay, how is Bruce Industries performing this quarter? How is Dunbar performing this quarter? And these industries didn't historically operate very well under those conditions. They were often owned by passionately invested original founders who, if they hit a rough month or a rough quarter or even a rough year, while they, I'm sure, weren't bananas about that, it made sense for them to sometimes put their own money into the company to make payroll and keep things afloat because, this is a company they plan on leaving to their kids, and this is their life's work. But when the companies became these, line items on these billion-dollar budgets, it didn't work like that. If the company had a bad quarter or a bad year, it was off with its head.
Right.
So the corporate acquisitions essentially ended this industry when we got to the economic downturn of 1980, 1981. The dog wasn't hunting like it used to, and these corporations said, okay, to hell with this.
And I remember in your speech you gave this absolutely fascinating quote, and I'm maybe maybe you can refresh my memory on who actually made this quote, but he essentially said a few years before this all happened, he predicted it entirely. He said all these companies are going down, and here's what it's going to be. Could you tell that part of the story?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to read part of it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so that was from Percy Solitoy, who was Bernie's mentor. He owned Brown Saltman Furniture, and he had gone to a conference in I think it was 1965 that was led by a lot of these corporations or corporate executives who were interested in coming into this field, and they sort of had this laundry list of what they found wrong with it. Oh, you got to do this. You got to maximize profit this way. How you guys are all, buddy and taking care of each other doesn't make any sense. That's not a good business model. And he was really bothered by this because he felt like, it might not work for how these other companies do business, but it's working just fine for us. Everybody in this industry is, enjoying enough. We can take care of our family. We can take care of each other. Even Bernie Roberts had a dedicated fund at Modeline that when a furniture or lighting executive would pass away, this fund would go to take care of the widow or widower and children of the competition, of the people who are copying his work. I mean, so really there was this level of camaraderie that was incredible in this industry. And, when these larger corporations got to look at it, they said, well, that's got to be the first thing to go. And, that's goofy that you do things that way. But yeah, I'll read the quote from the book if I can find it here.
Sure.
You'll have to edit out my page flipping.
We can easily do that.
Okay, I found it. But yeah, so this is from Percy Solitoy, Bernie's mentor in 1968. Says, I'd like to tell you where the furniture industry is going because I really think that I know. 2 years ago, I sat in on the first all-industry conference in San Francisco. For 3 days, I listened to outsiders, people not in the furniture business, tell us what they found wrong with it and what we should do. I came away very depressed because everything they said was true, and I couldn't see myself as a small manufacturer fitting into what they were talking about. 2 years have gone by, and I've had a lot of time to think about this, and I still feel the same way. This is what they told us. First, the furniture industry is an archaic industry in the sense that we are still doing business like our grandfathers. We're a papa and mama grocery store operation. And they told us, gentlemen, those of you who think you can go on doing business this way ought to get your money out of it and do something else. Because very soon now, something big is going to come along and run you right over, and you're going to be smashed into the ground. And what is that something? Nobody has to remind you that there's something happening called merging, and the pace is accelerating. These mergers are not furniture manufacturing companies in the old sense. They're conglomerates of all kinds of industries. This is how it will happen. First, the people in the business will merge with each other. There's been enough of this now that the really big conglomerates are starting to take a healthy look at us and see a brand new unmined field. And once they move in, the furniture business becomes a different kind of business, not only on the manufacturing, but on the retail level. Then designing is going to become a completely different game. Look at the auto business. Ford and General Motors and Chrysler, the big three, are not concerned with their dealers at all. Whatever you may think of their designs, they are very well attuned to what they think is a market. And they are attuned directly, not by way of all the filtering things that goes on in the furniture business. If I want to learn what the consumer wants and ask 10 of my dealers, I get 10 different answers. The auto people can make a design go because they go directly to the consumer with it. They have the money, the energy, the brains, the whole bit to go directly to the consumer with the product. The dealer merely operates as a vehicle through which this flows. It's a convenience for General Motors to do it this way, and when it stops being a convenience, I suppose they'll sell direct. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a good or a bad thing, but I do want to point out that the large manufacturer has more money to spend when it comes to the developmental aspects of our business. I think it's much simpler for Drexel to experiment with a new type of plastic or with automated manufacturing than it is for Brown Saltman. They'll spend up to $1 million and can easily justify that. It's not true that everybody who's small is going to disappear. There will survive some very small manufacturers who are specialists, who are design committed, innovators, and creative artists. They will be able to survive because they need only a little bit to survive on. But it also means that if a creative thing requires an enormous production facility to come about, that it cannot be.
That's amazing. It just sort of prefigures the entire market just a few years before it really happens. I just love that. So tell me the end of Modeline's story in particular.
Yeah, so in 1974-75, Bernie was becoming a bit uneasy with the trends he was seeing of all of these corporations buying these small manufacturers, and he was already seeing some of them get run into the ground by this, and he worried about his place and Modeline's place in this industry. So he was kind of approaching retirement age, so he took that opportunity to retire, as did Arthur Jacobs in 1976. And the brand was sold to a man named David Fields. And David is also this wildly interesting character who actually was working in advertising for President Richard Nixon's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, up to not long before this. He left working for Nixon when the climate around Nixon became untenable. And so Modeline was sold to David, who was also the president of General Mills' durable goods division. But David bought the company personally rather than for General Mills, and did pretty well with it for a few years. He brought on designer Charles Gibaltera, who designed what was called the California cactus, which was another iteration of the kind of biomorphic look, just a little bit more of a kind of a blend of Western and space age, very fitting for the late 1970s. But that went okay and got them to about 1978 until they had a flood. And even the flood is actually kind of an interesting story. So the factory that shared a wall with Modeline was owned by a professional framing service until the early 70s, but it was bought in 1974 by Muhammad Ali, the same Muhammad Ali, that Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
And he had retired from his boxing career, and he started a company manufacturing memorabilia and shaving cream, and you could buy a bar of soap that said Muhammad Ali soap or whatever, and it was being manufactured in this plant, and this plant was old and in disrepair. But anytime OSHA would come by to check on the plant, like they did with every plant in the era, Ali was very active there. He spent a lot of time down there, and they'd come in and oh, holy shit, it's Muhammad Ali, and so some of the checks on the list didn't get checked. And so this factory is sort of falling apart, and as a result, the water line blew and flooded the Modeline plant with several feet of water. So it's sort of a funny turn of events there, but yeah. So
that basically ends. They can't dig out of that event, is what you're saying.
They were heavily wounded by it. Yeah. By the time that they rebuilt enough, orders had been delayed so badly that they were shipping months behind schedule. So as soon as they caught up with that and got orders shipping out again, then at that point we're at 1980, economic downturn starts, and all of their dealers start calling them saying, look, we're gonna have to return this merchandise. Like we're shutting down. We're either going out of business entirely or we're dramatically scaling back. And then trigger the mass extinction event where all the corporations that had acquired these companies in the early and mid 70s start just selling off, and that led to the extinction of more than half of modern lighting manufacturers in that period.
So I'm looking at the California cactus lamp. It's really a neat design. Like you don't see anything like that today. And I guess, can you talk about modern lighting? Not the style of modern lighting, but what the lights that you see and the lamps that you see today. I have no taste, so I have no way of understanding or contextualizing, because to me a lamp is a lamp. But maybe I'm thinking, maybe that's because today there really isn't there's not a lot of differences. There's not a lot of art in the lamps that we buy or sell. Is that true? Like, what is the long-term consequence of the kind of extinction event you're talking about?
Yeah, well, the long-term consequence, I think, is it did lay the groundwork for the world that we currently inhabit. And back to that Percy Solitoy quote, the world that he was worried was coming, where dispassionate companies sell us disposable products, made by 9-year-olds somewhere that are gonna, fill a landfill in a few years. That's kind of where we're at, unfortunately. I mean, that's not to say that there are no lighting manufacturers who are creating impressive artistic products, but when I say that Modeline was a luxury item, it was a luxury item that was in reach for most middle class people. It wasn't. It wasn't something that was insanely out of reach. It was just considered it would have been equivalent to like buying the nicest trim package of the latest Ford, not like buying a Rolls Royce.
You and your fancy lamp.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And yeah, I think the long-term consequences is that I don't see that the lighting industry has really recovered since then, especially as evidenced by the designs that started to pop up once the dust from the recession in the 80s settled, were essentially just Modeline copies, and they're making these now and winning design awards for them and advertising them as original, but they're almost exact replicas of Modeline lamps. A good example that I give is that the best-selling floor lamp at every Walmart in the world is an almost exact copy of the Arthur Jacobs Model 7200, a bookcase floor lamp that he designed for Modeline. So they're kind of lacking original ideas, but they're happy to capitalize on the ideas of deceased designers.
Yeah, and
So
it seems
wait,
like no. Go ahead, man.
well, I was just going to say. So it sounds like it's an industry that's been enshittified.
Yes, yes, that'd be a good way of saying it.
Okay.
And that's one thing that I noticed that when I started my business, that I restore and sell these for a living, and there was such an exciting moment that came initially and keeps coming when new people find this, where they I hear all the time people saying, like, I didn't realize I needed this, I didn't realize how much I'd love this, and it's sort of like, they've grown up around these boring disposable products, and then they see something that was designed by people who are passionate about their field, and they just had no idea that anything like this existed. And it's really a sad thought to think that that's.
And there's kind of a craftsmanship there that was, that what you're talking about, today's lamps are just sort of made to be, disposed of. There's something different in that past, this little period that actual planned obsolescence wasn't a thing.
For sure, yeah. I think of I'm a classic car guy, and I think of the owner's manuals for many 50s and 60s cars gave instructions on, like, setting your timing, or some pretty what we would now consider to be very advanced mechanical work. They expected, like, this is a lifetime purchase, or this is the biggest purchase you're likely going to make next to your house. So you should know how to maintain this thing. It's built to be repaired, not replaced. And now, it's this totally different idea of, like, well, we can manufacture this thing for $1.75 and sell it for 30.
Right.
And who cares about the rest? We can sell 1 million of them a year. But yeah, I mean, the fact that these lamps are still around, and that they are fixable and restorable, even when I find them in very rough condition, they're built to come apart and be restored. They had this in mind at the time, and there's a lot of awareness that these lamps would outlive the designers and outlive the brand, and that was very intentional on their part.
So obviously, as a dealer, you need to know to ensure what you're buying is truly vintage, or what you're selling is truly vintage, and you can trace the lineage, and you're not selling a knockoff. Like, it's important for you to know this history. But why is it important for us to know this history? What do you think the lessons are, not just for modern lighting, but just as a commentary on broader sort of ways in which these business patterns have changed society?
Yeah, so a sentiment that I hear a dozen times a week, and we've all heard it applied to something, is, why don't they make things like they used to anymore? And I think there was a period of my life that I would have dismissed a comment like that as, oh, you just are remembering the good old days as better than they actually were. But there's a lot of truth, especially when it comes to the products that we buy, that something went wrong. That there was this better ethos that was abandoned at some point. And I think the least common denominator that I found in all of the ways this was, as you said, enshittified. That's a new word to me, but I think I'm going to have to use it. It was a dispassion, and you could reduce it to greed. You could say, well, it's they were only interested in the money and not interested in the product. But the least common denominator there to me was dispassion. They just stopped caring. They said, well, people will probably buy it if we sell them a slightly shittier product.
Well, they took the art out and they put the spreadsheet in.
Exactly.
So,
And
so
I see some of those things repeating themselves now. I mean, we started this discussion a little bit about the Groovewood thing. And where that came from is the exact same thing that ended the modern lighting movement in the first place. And it's how do I maximize how this financially benefits me, and the designer and the brand, all that be damned. That's not my role to protect this information. My role is to make some money off of this thing. So yeah,
So
I
you're talking
think
about like bad designers that are giving bad information to try to sell things that seem vintage but maybe aren't. Is that what you're
dealers, yeah,
saying?
yeah,
Dealers, yeah.
that's where all that bad information came from was from dealers, and well, why would a dealer say it's one particular designer over another, and why would they adamantly defend that, and why is that when I came to many of these dealers and said, oh, here's this better information, here's the true story, they said no thanks, and the reason was
No, we're
at least
good.
at,
We're going to keep lying. That's good.
at the time, and less so these days over the last few years, but at the time, you could slap a certain designer label on a lamp or manufacturer, and that was a very desirable name, and you could get a little bit more money for it, and that was the only thing that was important. So, yeah, I think part of the lesson is that people like that are dispassionate have no business in this industry. These are not to be overly harsh about it, but these are
No, we're super judgy. We
You,
like
you
yeah.
can be overly harsh about it. It's fine.
Okay, so
the industry needs to be taken over and run by communists again. Is that what you're saying?
that might be the case. That might be the case. I hear all the time from people who, I'll post a lamp for sale or show one that I'm restoring, and you hear all these stories of like, God, I grew up with this lamp. This was the backdrop to my high school graduation, or like, I remember, having my first child, and this lamp was, this is the backdrop to people's lives. This is, what we fill our homes with and create these environments. I mean, these are our oldest memories, and this is very important to a lot of people. And yeah, so I think degrading it and making it just about, how can I squeeze a little bit of cash out of this for me, it just cheapens the whole thing.
Well, now I think you still hear that where people say things like, well, look, if you can survive IKEA as a couple, a trip to IKEA, then your relationship is solid.
Yeah.
But so which is to say that actually decorations do matter. They do structure the art that surrounds your life. But I guess I want to ask, is there any hope? Like, is there a path back for an independent lighting sector? Are there companies out there? Can we even make these things in the US anymore? Or are we just kind of destined to never move beyond the styles of the 50s or 60s, or just bring in imports from people who are designing things abroad?
Yeah, I don't know who we need to turn up tariffs on. I'm joking, but to get that back in the U.S. But no, I'm an optimist. I think there's hope. Just based on my own experience of making people aware of these designs. Most of the conversations that I have with clients, or even just people who follow my work, like I said, to use a too on the nose metaphor, a light bulb goes off where they just see the beauty in this thing and they didn't, and now they suddenly care about this thing. I've had that experience with so many people, just over and over and over again. So yeah, I think part of it is pumping the market full of better ideas, and I can't go after every dealer or designer who is advertising a design as original when it's a knockoff. I don't have enough time to fight all those battles, but what I can do is put the right information out there and be as loud as possible about it, and it seems to be working. A good example of that is when I started this research, at least into Modeline of California. Most Modeline lamps were attributed to a designer named Adrian Pearsall, who's a furniture designer. Never designed lighting, but he was a big furniture designer in the 50s and 60s. And that was a name that commands a lot of money for furniture. So, again, same story as Groovewood, same story as 1,000 others. People would slap that name on there. It's an Adrian Pearsall lamp, and they'd get top dollar for it. But it's funny to watch the transition to me saying like, no, that's by Arthur Jacobs, no, that's by Jack Haywood, that's by John Keel, and the more noise I make on this subject, now you see those same dealers, hoping that their lamp is by Arthur Jacobs, and it's funny. I have to fight the impulse to be like, oh, where were you a few years ago when I was telling you that you had the answer wrong? Now that these names are actually recognized and people are starting to get really into them and collect them, now everybody wants to put these names on them, but. Yeah, I think it's getting better. It's slow moving, but the information online, at least as it relates to monoline lamps, when I began this research, something like between 70 and 90% of online listings credited the wrong manufacturer or designer. And now I just actually checked on eBay before we started this conversation and looked through the listings for Modeline lamps, and the vast majority of them are credited to the correct designer and manufacturer. So people do respond, and people do get excited about the information and passionate, and they get embarrassed to get the answer wrong. I mean, now that the right answers are kind of getting out there, a dealer doesn't want to have have to have their tail between their legs and apologize for selling a product as something that it wasn't. So,
Well, I think now we've converted Matt into having taste, and I think we hopefully will convert more of our listeners out there. This was great discussion. Thank you so much, Nick Ferrell, for telling us this history. Thanks for being here.
thanks for having me.
Organized money.
We don't think about beauty a lot as a function of power. It's just not part of our lexicon. But I grew up, and my grandparents, they had this weird apartment in Miami Beach, and I went there, and they had these strange lamps. I can remember them to get today. Just weird furniture, and there was something. It reflected their personality, but it was iconic to my childhood.
Yep.
And we just don't have anything like that.
I had the same thing. We had this thing called a mushroom lamp that was on the table as soon as you walked through the front door. In our kitchen, we had a table that was designed, has a bunch of steel on it. It's designed by a guy named Warren Plattner, and that name might sound familiar because Graham Plattner is his grandson. And he was a really, really famous architect and furniture designer. And it was an iconic look. And I remember when my parents moved, they threw all this furniture away, and now it's worth thousands of dollars. But it takes you back to that memory. It takes you back to your childhood or whatever. And yes, we have had this flattening, and it's amazing that it really is a function of, as you said in the interview, sort of the art coming out and the spreadsheets coming in.
So I thought that was a good line. I like that.
I agree.
I
agree with you on that one.
I'm going to give myself some
you
kudos
pat
for
yourself on the back.
that. Oh yeah, that was awesome, right?
Yeah.
So one of the places that I think about this loss of personality and uniqueness is actually rest stops. When you go in on the highway and you just encounter, you go to wherever you are, the rest stop is the same, and it's got the same coffee, the same candy, the same snacks, the same restaurants, and that's really strange. Historically weird, because regions have different cuisines. They have different things available. They have different people.
And there was a whole history of unique rest stops. Like there are books that have been written on this, and then Howard Johnson kind of standardized everything.
Well, standardized, but then there's been a private equity. There's been a roll up of rest stops, right? And
absolutely,
the candy is another thing. Like candy is just all the
used
same.
To have
now.
regional differences, right?
Yeah,
and it's the same thing with lighting. I mean,
it's the same thing with lighting, right?
This is really, we don't talk enough about the cultural effects of monopoly, the effects on aesthetics, the effects on style, and that's what I thought this conversation really brought out in an accessible way.
I also think behind that is something that is pretty profound about the human condition. So this guy Bernie, I forget what his last name is, but the guy
Bernie Roberts.
Bernie Roberts.
So just say it again. Yeah, this guy Bernie Roberts.
Okay, so this guy Bernie Roberts, communist weirdo, right? And hired a bunch of other communist weirdos, and they built these beautiful lamps. And there is something beautiful about embracing weirdos. And I think that right now we have a flattening of the human spirit more broadly. I think if you're weird, you get pushed down.
And it's not just a cultural thing. Like the thing I was thinking about when we were having the conversation was, this is the Boeing story. This is the story of the engineers at Boeing who, after a merger with McDonnell Douglas, suddenly the financiers got in charge.
Right.
And all this innovation where they were, building these great planes, that went away and they started building planes that would fall out of the sky. So, it's not just, the things that are beautiful or that are aesthetic that fall prey to this kind of power dynamic, but it's everything.
Yeah. And it's just that sense of weirdness, which I really treasure. And it's just sad to see today that in a really very real sense, only people who are rich can afford to be weird.
Yeah.
And that's crazy. That to me, there's such a profound
Well, yeah.
loss.
I mean, if you look at the kinds of objects that Nick deals in, and these great modern lights, they are very expensive. They fill these houses of very, very rich people, and they're great, but they're not. It's a niche thing now that is not necessarily for the masses, and it could have been.
Well, I'm saying
was.
that's true. That's true. But I'm not actually saying about affording lamps. What I'm saying is, if you're the Bernie Roberts of today,
right? You're doing
there's
it from
no,
the
there's no
the
like you get pushed
manufacturer.
out and there's nowhere to go. You can't start a business.
Right.
It's the
You're doing it from the
ability
entrepreneur.
the
entrepreneur
ability
angle.
to
Yeah.
be a weird person, right?
Right.
Has been I
and
think
to find other weird people who
right.
connect
And-
with your
and-
ideas and make a thriving enterprise out of it.
It's just different, and I think that's something that we need to reclaim. That kind of make Portland weird again. That thing, keep Portland weird, like
keep
that.
Boston weird. Yeah.
Keep Boston weird. That there's something real to that. So anyway,
Right.
I really enjoyed this conversation. So next week we'll have another good episode of Organized Money.